expect to was possessed of a singular vision, and because he was my friend and because I loved him so dearly, I perhaps didn't see it until I edited his work. He asked me to edit his work on his deathbed. He said, "It's all yours, Chief," and passed it over to me as he outlined what he thought would be his book. He had given his 10 prime years of his philosophical life to building up the community of the Department of Philosophy at Memorial University, and planned to spend the next 10, 20 years working on philosophy. But that's not what happened. Instead, death was what was in store for him, and a very rapid death. And in the light of that, without a note of melancholy, he passed the whole thing into my hands, and he said, "It's all yours, Chief. Do with it what you will." And it took me 9 years to put it together with the help of several people, some of whom are here, Michelle Mahoney, and Scott Johnston, Jennifer Dyer, some of whom are not here, but whom I've mentioned in the book. It was a labor of love, and it was something that kept getting kind of shifted from one set of priorities to another, but was never for a moment something that I was not going to do. So it's a great pleasure for me to have done it. And as I did it, I learned something about my beloved friend, Jim Bradley, that not only was he a wonderful man, a beau vivant, but he was actually a great philosopher. And he caused my thinking to change as I edited his work. So I was hoping that tonight we could say a few words. I know it's late and we're drinking and it's not time for 3 hours of talks, but we're not going to do that. But we could say a few words about his work. So I'll just say this one word. Neither analytic nor continental, for two reasons, I think. Yes, the analysts want logic without ontology, and that won't do. And the continentalists want ontology without logic, and that's a disaster. The analysts didn't make a mistake by moving from subject-predicate logic into the speculative generalization of the function or the binding variable. Thank you, Steve Gardner. That was actually needed, absolutely needed, so that the forms that were substances in eternity could become rules for thinking about an emergent order of being. Jim was completely behind that, which is why he was as at home in the analytical community as he was anywhere. But the analysts made a mistake, and they thought that their existential quantifier solved the problem of the question of being. Namely, being was just filling out the variable, instantiation, and that was a disaster. Because the question of being for Jim was the philosophical question, and being could never be reduced to instantiation and still satisfy the principle of reason. That is, an adequate account for the fact that there is something rather than nothing. So the analysts had logic, but they had no ontology, and there was really very little going on there of interest. Over on the other side, we had the Heideggerians, the ontologists, and the descriptivists of various kinds. They were all into the question of being, but they had forsaken the principle of reason for very dodgy reasons for forsaking the principle of reason. Think about the performative contradiction there. But essentially, explanation and logic had been surrendered with so-called ontotheology. Because all roads led to the highest being, we should stop trying to give an explanatory account of the things that are. And so what we end up with is varieties of descriptions, you know. And I remember Jim's intolerance of this, because I arrived at Memorial in 2007, sort of doing phenomenology, and immediately realized that Jim had absolutely zero respect for phenomenology, or the prissy phenomenology. For him, phenomenology was just retreating from some task, which was philosophy's task, regardless of whether it could be completed or whether it was constantly changing, which was to explain things, to give an account that would be satisfying, at least for the moment, to the principle of reason, not the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason presumes a finished cosmos. But Jim's cosmos, Jim's universe, is the modern universe, which is an evolving universe, a universe of emergent order, not a settled order. So we don't know where it's going. We don't know where it's going to finish. But reason is actually quite ready to deal with such a thing and has the tools that it needs, some of which came from the theological tradition, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity, and others that came from Frege and Russell and F.H. Bradley. But for this reason, for the reasons I just mentioned, logic without ontology happening among the analysts, and the ontology without logic happening among the Heideggerians and the phenomenologists, Jim found no home in contemporary philosophy, which isn't to say that he didn't read it all, because he did, and he had something very incisive to say about everything. And it's amazing how much is in that book of 10 essays. So that's all I want to say about Jim Bradley's philosophy. And now I would like to invite our first speaker, which would be Scott Johnston, say a word or two about Jim's work. Scott came on the scene right as Jim was retiring from the headship, and then as it turns out, from life itself. And Scott arrived full of interest in the things that Jim loves: speculative philosophy, German idealism, C.S. Peirce, pragmatism. So it was a kind of amazing kind of entry-exit moment. But whatever time Scott didn't have with Jim, he certainly made up for in working with me over this text. I'm really delighted to invite Scott Johnston to the floor for this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. So, as Sean said, my encounter with Jim began very late in Jim's career, indeed close to the end of his life. I think I first met Jim in 2011. At that time, I was attempting a spousal hire. I was at Queen's. I'd been there for several years. My wife, Shemay, had just taken a position in linguistics and education, and I was hoping to come to St. John's. Jim was very open to the idea, very forthcoming, and encouraged me. And I believe, did a very nice selling job to the rest of the department. But beyond that, Jim and I realized we had some similar philosophical interests. And at the time Jim was headlong into a very careful investigation of Charles Saunders Peirce's work. And in fact, this work that he was doing was the side of Peirce that often gets overlooked. This is Peirce the metaphysician rather than Peirce the behaviorist, or Peirce as the so-called founder of pragmatism. And it just so happened that I was very interested in that myself, having come out of the pragmatist tradition and having read quite a bit by that point in time of Peirce. So we had a number of very intense conversations. Unfortunately, the conversations did not continue because Jim soon after that became ill. And I had to go back and fulfill commitments at Queen's University. But I did begin to take an interest in Jim's work. And I remember one of Jim's essays in particular, which was called Beyond Hermeneutics, in which he dealt with the Trinity and Charles Saunders Peirce, became of great interest to me. And I wrote an essay on that paper that Jim had written, and began to consider Jim's take on Peirce, and perhaps more importantly, the Trinity, in a more serious way than I would have otherwise. From the standpoint of Jim's last essays, it becomes clear that Jim's metaphysics is not only speculative, but is very much concerned with the idea of ordination. We might think of that as a sort of consecration. So we think of holy orders, for example, and we think of investiture and this sort of thing. It wasn't enough for Jim that we begin with an absolute idea of something. And that idea, therefore, becomes the be-all and end-all of our metaphysical pursuit. And so Jim, I think, gravitated to Peirce precisely because Peirce gave us an understanding of the cosmos in which there were first things. And these first things could not be argued away. But by the same token, first things are possibilities and require something else in order to become actualities, in order to become actualized. But even more than this, there had to be something that mediated both the possibility, which for Jim was pure, and the actuality, which was immediate and emergent. And this Jim found in Peirce's notion of the Trinity. So for Peirce, we have firstness, which is pure possibility. We have secondness, which is this actuality. It's immediate, it's emergent, it's action and reaction. But we also have this law or principle of continuity, which has its mathematical side, certainly, but also its existential side. And it functions to mediate the other two and move us beyond them. And so this idea of ordination, I think, is well captured in Peirce by the idea that this thirdness, we can call it mind if we want, is potentially infinitely continuous. And therefore the universe, the cosmos, is in a state of continuous emerging. This sense of Peirce, I think, captured what Jim was trying to get at towards the very end of his scholarly career. It's difficult to say whether Jim would have stopped with Peirce, because Jim seems to me a restless thinker who is not satisfied with any one particular position. But it certainly, I think, is emblematic of where Jim was in 2011 when he and I had those very interesting first conversations. And I'll stop there.
There's lots of chairs. If everybody's happy back there standing, but please, there's plenty of seats. Okay. Easier exit to the bar, too. I'd like to invite Jim's life partner and the mother to his children and his intellectual partner, Jennifer Dyer, to the front of the room. Please, give a hand to Jennifer. That doesn't work.
Go down.
Do you need a hand, Sean?
Right, I got it. I'm just gonna make sure we don't. Is that all right?
Yeah, it's perfect.
All right. So I got something a little bit different than Scott. Okay, so Sean asked me to say a few words and give a sense of who Jim was. So I've got two parts, and I'm not that brief, but I'll try to be.
Don't worry, everybody's.
So two parts, so I'm just going to say a few things about the Jim I knew. And then I'm going to get into his philosophy through an address that I gave on his behalf for his honorary doctorate at the Dominican College, which I think Craig put together. Thanks, Craig. So the Jim Bradley I knew drank weak tea all day long. He loved to dance. and was, as Peter Harris described, completely obsessed with philosophy. 30 years ago, Jim helped begin the Jockey Club and the Downtown Lecture Series that both brought philosophy into the community in St. John's, a huge passion of his. He put together many MOUs between memorial and philosophy departments in Germany, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France, Norway, and Austria, and that's what I could remember. And he was a force in bringing to Memorial distinguished speakers in philosophy and theology and aesthetics primarily. Jim also continued to be a Marxist, despite his begrudging hereditary respect for what used to be called the British Empire. And Jim described himself as a caricature of himself, a unique combination of all the stereotypes of the English, all of them together. And as one friend said, Jim celebrated his sartorial splendor through a large and varied selection of bow ties, well before a fox needs got a balloon, funky vests, and very bonkers hats. He was certainly unique, and he was loved for that. At home, Jim was a terrible math teacher and a terrible cook. He stand out, as Steve can attest. But a marvelous mise-en-scène party planner, a YouTube aficionado. So what's mysterious here is that he's not there, but he lived there.
He will be there.
There we go. And a never-ending historical narrator. And there are a few people here who know every detail of the Yalta Conference, thanks to Jim's never-ending historical narratives. Another side of Jim, 50 years ago, when Jim's best friend was coming out to his family, and this was 50 years ago, so it was tough. Jim was the person he brought to support him in this process. I love that story. Jim maintained very active and decades-long friendships in every continent, which is amazing. He was also proud to hold what Leslie Armour, some people may know of Leslie, Leslie Armour called the best philosophical library east of Montreal. And he and I discussed and argued our various ideas and articles and projects every day for 18 years. It's gonna blew my mind when I read that. To discuss his work and the ongoing philosophical discussions Jim would have with anyone, I have chosen not to paraphrase him, but to use Jim's own words about one of the strongest topics in his philosophical inquiries, to my mind. I think we'll be veering off of it. The topic is love. Jim's own development of a theory of speculative metaphysics was the development of a theory of existence that was strong, dynamical, and relational against what he called weak and deflationary theories of existence, usually characterized by naturalism. To my mind, his thought predicts much of the current work that I teach on affect theory, new materialism, coalitional politics. His career was defined by figures such as F.H. Bradley, Dorothy Emmett, Anne Whitehead, and especially Peirce. And in that context, it was, from what I could tell, the realism and semiotic constructivism of Peirce with which Jim most especially identified. This philosophy takes as its apex, as its fundamental nature of existence, love or unconditional concern for others. Being or activity, he argues, is not, Jim Bradley argues, is not primarily analyzed here as substance or as subject, but as communication. The unconditional communication of freedom by the principle of actualization. Unconditional communication is thus the actualizing condition of substance and of subjectivity, of all determination. At this point, we cannot avoid the question, just what is unconditional communication? There is only one answer. Being as communication is love, as unconditional giving or donation, unconditional concern or agape. Only in this way can the spontaneity and individuality of things, and in particular the contingent evolution of physical nature, be properly secured. And the reason is that unconditional concern is open to what it does not control or determine. It does not stand in opposition to contingency, nor does it treat contingency as a lower moment of some absolute completeness. For unconditional concern surrenders itself to contingency. We see this in parental love, in all genuine love. As Peirce says in his essay on evolutionary love, the movement of love is circular, at one and the same impulse, projecting things into independency and drawing them into harmony. For the ancient Greeks, as well as for a philosopher like Iris Murdoch, love, as eros, is the medium by which we aim properly to apprehend and to participate in the ultimate reality. In contrast, the claim here is that the ultimate reality is love, as infinite or inexhaustible agape. This is the infinity, the infinite love, which is the active condition of order in the universe, the ground of the complications that, wherever possible, accompany ordination. All specific complications or communities, not just the human mind, but mathematical order, time and space, possibly even extensity, are contingent. Yet complication, or better, inclusive community, is not. For these reasons, the real is not only the true, the real is essentially the good. In the context of the history of our philosophy and culture, there is nothing original or mysterious about this claim. This is an ancient claim, and I, Jim Bradley, have tried to indicate that not only is it a conceptually clear and powerful claim, but it is an immensely productive claim, the arena in which the hugely important, even globally transformative notions of relations, persons, historicity, events, and agapic love as the basis of existence and of justice have been elaborated. It is a claim that in fact tacitly informs all our attitudes, a claim by which in fact we tacitly measure all our actions. Put it like this: do you value or have high regard for that principle? If so, note that it cannot be derived from any lesser principle. It is irreducible. And its irreducibility constitutes an ethical clue to the ultimate nature of reality. Experience demands that we go beyond descriptivism and naturalism here. For one of our historically saturated intuitions is that the hallmark of all genuine love is some element of unconditional concern. This is not a feeling or a disposition, for we can and should show unconditional concern to those we may be disposed to dislike, even hate. We have here an alignment of feeling and action with an ideal, where feeling is no longer erotic, nor merely an effective sentiment of sympathy, but a matter of self-surrender. How else can this be understood except as a spiritual act, in the sense of a total orientation of our natures that transcends natural impulse? It is something more than just mind, something more than ordinary feeling, and usually involves extraordinary action. What has to be said is that where there is such love, and we can find it manifest in artworks as well as people, we have a glimpse of the perfect unity of feeling, exertion, and rule. This is a perfection that has its reason, its only reason, in the ultimate order of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was extraordinary. And there it is. That's Jim Bradley. That's the philosophy of Jim Bradley. That's the core of the thing. So for the next portion of our evening, I've invited four, do I have four? Yes, I think I do. Four of Jim's students who have gone on to have careers, perhaps it was three. I've lost track. Well, anyway, some of Jim's students who I've invited to come up to the front of the room and just to offer us something. My question doesn't bind them, but I said, tell me about a concept that you've taken from Jim and which you've carried forward into your work, or something that you remember of his work. So I think I'd start with Steve Gardner, if you wouldn't. Steve Gardner is adjunct professor or per course instructor at Memorial University, a mathematical genius, expert in all things logic, the tutor of Jim Bradley's children in mathematics, and the tutor of most of the Department of Philosophy in things logical, and somebody that Jim regarded with great esteem in terms of his astute understanding of matters formal. So, Steve, you have the.
Thank you, Sean. In
the fall of 1998, I was taking mostly electives at that time because I was taking a major in mathematics and I had finished most of the required courses. One of my friends in the math program had mentioned to me, told me about philosophy of math, which I was very interested in, and he suggested that maybe I should take analytic philosophy. So Jim was teaching that in 1998, and well, the rest is history. He took me under his wing. He was my intellectual mentor, and he wrote a reference for basically everything I've ever applied for. He was my master's thesis supervisor, and he was the department head when I first started teaching at Memorial. So that one course is probably the most influential, most important course in my entire undergraduate career, and we, for many years, enjoyed a kind of inside conspiracy that we had to undermine at every opportunity, undermine the Russellian hegemony that dominated the world. I suppose I owe my career in logic, I owe to Jim Bradley. I think he's the single most important person in the history, in my personal history, intellectual development. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Steve. The point is the early Wittgenstein. I'd like to invite Gil Shalev. Gil Shalev is well known to as the reigning Pope of the Jockey Club for over a decade. Now a father and completing his PhD, someone who has been in the Department of Philosophy for almost as long as Jim Bradley.
Yes. In the fall of '96, I registered here, '95 actually, I have to date myself even more. I registered here at Memorial doing psychology, terrible. And I was very disheartened with what I was doing, and I bumped into a young Seamus O'Neill. Seamus O'Neill here? No, Seamus O'Neill. And Seamus O'Neill said, I'm going to introduce you to Vance Maxwell, who some of you will remember. And Professor Vance Maxwell says, you need to study a real field. You need to study philosophy. Some of you will recognize who Vance Maxwell is. I hope there's a few faces here that remember Vance Maxwell. So in the fall of '96, I decided to take my first philosophy class, which was, of course, Introduction to Philosophy. And Jim was known for many years to do, most of us have this kind of trajectory when we do Intro to Philosophy. We'll do the Greeks, and we might do some pre-Socratics. We'll move to Descartes. We'll do something more contemporary. Jim would regularly teach his Intro to Philosophy just Hume and Descartes, and sometimes just Hume. Sometimes we'll do a whole course just on Hume for intro, which was spectacular. So Jim really opened my eyes, and very quickly I abandoned. My psychology professors were not very happy about this, but I told them I was switching field and I was doing philosophy. And that was, he was a real mentor in terms of, for those of you who know me, I really, doing things rigorously and looking at texts rigorously and carefully is something maybe to my detriment, but it's something that Jim really instilled in me, to look at things really carefully and attentively. Of course, those of you who know me know that my interest is in early modern, especially Cartesian philosophy. And when I did the intro to class with Jim in '96, he says to me, I see a future for you doing philosophy. You should study the philosopher's philosopher. And he just left it at that. I'm like, well, I don't know what he really meant by that. And then, a few months went on, and then Peter Harris, the great late Peter Harris, said, no, you should study the philosopher's philosopher. I'm like, who the hell is he talking about? And of course, and this is going to be what I will say here, of course, the philosopher's philosopher was none other than Immanuel Kant. So the first class I really did with Jim Bradley in detail was his course on the critique of pure reason. And of course, I'm no Kantian. I'm very much interested in Kant's early philosophy, his pre-critical stuff and arguments for the existence of God, ones that he debunks and ones that he writes about. And I found Jim's teaching of the critique of pure reason and his understanding of Kant to be absolutely superb, and his analysis of the text and where it fit in with German thinking was absolutely superb. Now, to say something a bit more concrete about ideas, Jim had as those of you who are familiar with the critique of pure reason, of course, there's a strong refutation there about the ability of reason to demonstrate the existence of God. Kant denies the ability of reason to, in the pure use of reason, to be able to do this. And he goes through a process of denying the different types of ontological arguments. But he shows some kind of sympathy, of course, towards the cosmological arguments. And this is something that I always found interesting myself as a Cartesian. I very much was enamored with the third meditation. It was something that is still something I'm really passionate about. And Jim had a really fascinating understanding of a pre-critical work of Kant that most people at the time never even told me existed, which is aptly called the one demonstration for the existence of God, which Scott will probably know it's a good 20 plus years prior to the critique of pure reason, if I'm not mistaken. And in that is a beautiful synthesis of his critique of Descartes' thinking and Descartes' ontological arguments and Descartes' cosmological argument. And it's something that really inspired me to keep on thinking about Descartes and keep on thinking about both the upshot and the shortcomings of these kind of demonstrations. And this was one part of Kant that I found absolutely brilliant in Jim's analysis. And one other thing I would mention, because this is most of my familiarity, I know Jim did not consider himself a Kantian by any means, but was his very thorough understanding of where post-Kantian thinkers, namely people like Fichte, stood in that whole debate of where the thing in itself was located. And he really put that whole picture of where we see the dynamic between the phenomena and the noumena, the way the post-Kantians saw it, in a way that was never properly explained to me till Jim explained it. And it's something that till this day not that I continued studying German idealism, but it's something that really resonated with me and made the critique of pure reason, which is not an easy text, somewhat more understandable. But in general, it really sparked an interest in me to do what I do as in detail and as rigorously as possible. Thank you.
We have two more students, and then we have one online Zoom participant, Frank Peddle from Dominican, I think. So I'd like to invite Michelle Mahoney up to the front. Michelle Mahoney is a very old friend of Jim Bradley's. She's now completing her. Sorry, I put that wrong. You're not old at all. And you've been a friend of Jim Bradley's for a long time. But what I wanted to say was that Michelle is finishing her PhD, almost finished, at Memorial, and she is the first to write a dissertation on C.S. Peirce at Memorial University. It's something that Jim Bradley would be deeply proud of and excited about. So Michelle Mahoney, please.
Because everyone has spoken so beautifully and I'm feeling all of it. So I am a very old friend of Jim because I met him right out of high school and I came from Conception Bay. I came into Memorial, so excited to go to university, so excited to get out of the Bay, big world of books. And I walk into my first philosophy class. I graduated in '86, and there was this extraordinary person, excited, exuberant, and he started to talk, and I just went, "Oh, I'm really here. This is it." So I was lucky enough to have done my first course in philosophy with Jim Bradley. So ideas were flying off the wall, but more stuff. There was a sense of form, continuity, and why you want to study what you study. But he put us through the rigors. It was fantastic. My second course in philosophy the next term was with Peter Harris. So it was an extraordinary introduction, and they had me. I think that I've had a strange and varied life, but one of the most interesting points with Jim was that I finished what was then the new MPhil that Jennifer and I did on our really good friends. We were then and are now, and I finished that, and I was like, okay, this is fine. And Jim said, okay, now we have to start doing grad courses in philosophy. We're going to start with the logic. We're going to start with Frege. I went, okay, I can do this. And I think I lasted about 6 months. And then I was like, hey, Jim, you know, I got a chance to go to Eastern Europe. I just think I need to get the hell out of Newfoundland. This is terrible. I'm overwhelmed. So anyway, the reason I tell this is that Jim knew philosophy was really, really important to me. He worked with me as a supervisor during the MPhil. I read way too much Heidegger, and he and Peter Harris helped guide me through. And I think that he knew that there was something in me that needed to come back and do philosophy. It was a necessity. It was intuitive. We all knew each other very well. Anyway, I returned. PhD program had just started. No, I'm so sorry. I moved back to Newfoundland. We had a lot of good years with Jim and Jennifer before he got sick and passed away. And anyway, the PhD program got started up, and I got a call from Sean McGrath, and he said, Jim Bradley says I was to call you because we've started this program, and you're first on this list, Michelle. You need to do your PhD in philosophy. And I was in a full tenure track. I was teaching, and I just went, oh, okay. And I left teaching, and I came to start the PhD. And what it feels like now is I've had another career just in the years I've been doing the PhD, because I've been doing so many interesting things while doing it in conjunction with philosophy here and in other places. So I guess the point is that my love of C.S. Peirce comes straight out of Jim's work. And I love that work because it's built on dynamism, the possibility for the radically new, a logic of growth, a logic of change with continuity, but it's built out of an absolute dedication to the principle of flourishing that engages love as the capacity for anything. And because it operates as firstness, you can't have anything without possibility. Possibility is love. And you go on and you work through really complicated, you know how to suddenly defeat Heidegger's arguments using Peirce. You get powerful, you get clever, and then I think you start to get very, very respectful of the mind that C.S. Peirce is, but the mind that put me to the C.S. Peirce, who read absolutely everything. I think for the good of philosophy, and it's my, I guess I'm living out my dream to try to do something for the good of that philosophy that Jim has given so many of us opportunity to pursue. I won't go into any complicated work things. I think everyone's spoken so beautifully. Thank you very much.
So in 2003, I came and gave a guest lecture at Memorial University, hunting for a job right out of the U of T. And Jim Bradley was very gracious, as he always was. And he brought me to Bitters afterwards with Peter Harris, I think, and one other man who was the crab fisherman who does philosophy. The crab fisherman who does philosophy. And the crab fisherman who does philosophy now just does philosophy, I think. But Craig Cramm, a very old friend of Jim Bradley's, perhaps I'm not going to say that, has been a friend of Jim Bradley for a long time. Craig finished his PhD at the University of Ottawa under Leslie Armour, wasn't it? Leslie Armour? Yeah. Who's and there's a story there, but we won't go into it. But there's a Canadian idealism thing that Jim Bradley is part of, and Craig is a product of. So it's wonderful to have Craig come to the podium right now and give us his 5 minutes on Jim Bradley. Craig.
Thank you. I have a prepared statement. So going on. Is this live on YouTube or something?
The whole world will be watching it forever, Craig.
Yeah, I know. I thank Professor Sean McGrath for the opportunity to speak during this event, celebrating the publication of the late Professor James Bradley's collected essays in speculative philosophy. On this evening dedicated to his thought, I will restrict myself to a few remarks on Dr. Bradley's influence as a philosophy teacher of the first rank. And on that, I think everyone agrees. My first encounter with Professor Bradley was as an undergraduate here at Memorial, a course on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Being a student of his at this level was, for lack of a better word, sublime. I'll explain. That doesn't mean nice. It's a whole.
Overwhelming.
Yeah. To be in the presence of his superb wit and intellect was inspiring and transformative, fun. That's the word that's the center of this. But also somewhat terrifying. Similar, right? This will make sense shortly. You want to do your best, which is different, I thought, from most engagements with academics. As you were able, over the 5 essays and 1 class presentation that you're required to do. I remember my presentation on Kant's schematism. Not what I said, like now, certainly, but having done it with someone, the gaze looking at me, petrified. Bradley said, keep doing philosophy, so I did. The paper presentation on schematism being the basis of my MA thesis on Heidegger, and of which he was my thesis supervisor. For some reason, I kept doing philosophy as a PhD, of which, again, he was often a principal advisor. So I think Steve mentioned it, or several mentioned it. It was a transformative, and Gil mentioned it, like the engagement with Jim as a teacher was a kind of sublime. Something turned, something happened. So Bradley's conceptual influence on my work centers on his approach to philosophy and its fundamental principles. I will now conclude with a few words on my understanding of these things. So, as an orientation to ideas, speculative metaphysics presumes a certain freedom from inherited frameworks of meaning. This reflective openness emerges from the inescapable coincidence of thought and existence. Since it is part of reality, thought must possess reality's principles in some way. But it is by nature incomplete and vague, as we all know who work in metaphysics. But to truly think is to make systematic sense of this entanglement. With Bradley, I claim this kind of philosophy not only has a history, but is its history. Speculative metaphysics is historical metaphysics. It must deal with the whole tradition to become sufficiently disentangled. We must understand decisive principles on reality as they are first articulated, develop, and entwine with other principles, creating, preserving, and often destroying worlds. For Bradley, this process, as Scott mentioned, resulted in a study of Trinitarian metaphysics, culminating in the science and philosophy of Charles Saunders Peirce. Bradley viewed Peirce as this tradition's most recent and most powerful incarnation. So by way of orientation, that's what I think I learned from Jim. And the problem, of course, with this orientation is that it takes a lifetime of reading to know the entire tradition, and then something unfortunate like you get older. So it's a strange undertaking to know the whole thing. It takes time. At a university, that seems to be not trendy, to let people develop. And so on. So the first principle, I think, if I'm reading him properly after Jennifer, I think I am now, I also agree with Bradley on the astonishing, mocked, shunned, hated, misunderstood hypothesis of Trinitarian metaphysics. Reality's own principle is low, but it's a position also taken by my most present subject of study, the ecological metaphysics of Max Scheler, which I'm heavily into. Scheler, not Peirce, will take my attention for a while. Perhaps they will overlap. Scheler's New Human Being in Peirce's New Nature. So Scott says something profound to me that maybe it wouldn't have stopped with perks. Maybe something else would have engaged him along the way. I'm playing shade. Finally, James Bradley was my teacher, but he was also my friend. And it was in the latter reality that the truth of speculative philosophy still draws its energy. Thank you for your generous attention. I think that's it.
Great. We have one more, right? Oh, I think one more Zoom presentation online. Is that right, Dante? Or is there more than one?
Yeah. You want to move to the slide slightly?
So Frank Peddle.
That's GGS Scott.
Oh, David Scott. So David Scott, you're welcome to speak too. Okay, we'll get on mute him.
You want me to go? Can you all hear me?
Here's Frank.
Just shout Jim Bradley if you can hear me.
So David, are you going to speak as well as Frank?
I'll say a couple of words, sure.
Okay, so we'll start with David and finish with Frank. How about that?
Sounds good.
David Scott is a professor of philosophy at the University of Victoria and an old friend of Jim Bradley. A lot of them around. It has nothing to do with how young you are. That's the other one. Yeah, so, and then what else can I say about David? David is also somehow connected to us because he's John Scott's nephew. He taught here and has had, I think, been profoundly affected, as we all have, by the philosophy of James Bradley. So David, it's to you.
Thank you, Sean, for including me in this lovely, thoughtful, celebratory gathering. And it's I wish I could be there myself. I know that there are many, many old friends with whom I've been completely blotto years ago. A very good time. I don't think I've had a more intellectually, emotionally stimulating time in my life as I had in those years when I taught and studied at Memorial while Jim was there. But anyway, one thing I'd like to say about Jim, and I'm sure many people will have said this before, I'd like to sort of just remind myself and everybody of his extraordinary intellectual and I guess emotional, but just intellectual generosity. I think everybody who's listening to this right now is the beneficiary of his generosity. He seems to, well, I can only speak for myself. I'm guessing that the same is true of others, though. To speak for myself, he saw things in me. I think that I didn't see, and he patiently and always with fun drew things out of me, and I've been at lots of jockey clubs where he drew things out of others too, and there was a real generous spirit there that I've not encountered anywhere else in my personal life and in my professional life, and so that's something I wanted to pass on. Yeah, that's about all I wanted to say right now. Thank you for including me.
Very old friend, Frank Peddle is a professor, a lawyer, professor at Dominican College, and Jim has had a relationship with the Dominican College in Ottawa for many years. And there's a kind of kindred spirit going on there, speculative philosophy in Ottawa, a mysterious story there that we've been working on over the years. Frank has been teaching there, administration. He's also a lawyer, which helps him quite a bit. Frank, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I should say, everybody, Jim persuaded me to give up the law for speculative philosophy, and I'm eternally thankful for that. I first want to say thank you, Sean, for getting this book out. This is a tremendous thing. I've had a lot of these essays that I think are in this book in various forms in a filed folder here for a long time. And I ordered the book when you sent the email out a little while ago, and I'm looking forward to getting it in the near future. So that's you certainly get a great thanks, expansive thanks, I think, from all of us for doing that. I also am very nostalgic like David. I wish I was there tonight. Jennifer, it's been a long time since I've seen you. Scott, everybody. And I think I've been in the Guv'nor once or twice. If it's on Elizabeth Avenue, I went to high school across the street there at Prince of Wales Collegiate in antediluvian times. Leslie Armour and Jim Bradley were close friends, and Leslie was a colleague of mine for many, many years at Dominican University College. And when Jim passed away, Leslie said to me, "What a great loss. We all love to lament the loss of Jim Bradley for speculative philosophy and idealistic studies in Canada." And there's nothing more true than that. And I hope with this book, we can continue that tradition through, hopefully we'll be able to maybe start up a more formal society and keep it going. And Leslie, of course, also made a great contribution to idealistic studies in Canada as well. And he unfortunately passed away not long after Jim in 2014. One other anecdote, when Jim was set up in his, I guess it was his dining room there, Jennifer, I'm not sure, on Strawberry Marsh Road, and he had the hospital bed in there, and Craig Cramm and I went and visited him. And I said, "Jim, if I had plenipotentiary powers," at the time I was running Dominican University College, which is no power whatsoever, but if I had plenipotentiary powers, Jim, what do you think I would do if I could control every philosophy department in Canada? And without hesitation, he looked at him, he said, "Get rid of all those introductory textbooks written by junior American professors." I said, "Well, I'll see what I could do." And he had ordered, at the time, he had boxes all around his bed that he was ordering on Amazon of original works by people. And it was really funny. And of course, Jim did a great deal for our college as well. He helped us, he did the initial review of our graduate programs back at least 15 years ago now for the Ontario Council of Graduate Studies. He was an external reviewer on that, and that was tremendous help for us in what eventually became an affiliation with Carleton University in Ottawa, which allowed us as a denominational institution to get full funding from the Ontario government. And we were able to preserve ourselves in that way. And we owe a tremendous debt to Jim and the work he did on that file many years ago. Actually, the year he passed away was the year we signed the formal affiliation agreement with Carleton. And for that and for his philosophical support and camaraderie with the faculty at our institution, we gave him an honorary doctorate, and Jennifer was very kind to come up and give the address at that occasion some years ago. Just philosophically, I'll be really brief. I see myself, some of the work I want to do in triadicity and so on, and trinities and the stuff Jim has written on triune events and work like that. I see building on that. I'm not in opposition to it in any way. I think we need to take the work now that Sean McGrath has put together and develop this more. And I hope we can going forward. It's an important part of continuing the speculative tradition. And I think it's extremely important for our country and the philosophical life and spirit of this country that we continue that tradition and certainly advance upon what Jim and develop the thoughts that Jim has contributed to it. So thank you very much for this event, everybody. And I hope that you all succeed very well in keeping Jim's spirit and thought alive. Thank you.
And we have started a society for idealist studies some years back. So I think maybe we just launched it. Let's say we did. So thanks for reminding
This is the official launch.
This is the official launch. And I want to say, Jim, here's your book. I think there's definitely more to drink, so please stick around. Thanks to all of you.
That's
That's right.